screen. So good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to stand in for Paul while he's away, and I'm going to chair this session. My name is Mark Winterbottom. I'm one of the leads of Focus Area 4 in Tapas, and this is the latest in a series of seminars which is part of a Tapas network, which is focused on tackling air pollution in schools. Just a little bit of housekeeping first. The session is being recorded, so if you don't want your face to be recorded or your audio to be recorded, then turn your camera off and mute your microphone. Please, would everybody stay on mute anyway during the presentations, because it just simplifies things if we get extraneous noise. And if you've got any questions that occur to you throughout or towards the end of a seminar, then please put them in the chat, and what we'll do is at the end of the seminar, then we'll put the questions to the speakers. Now, if you've been here before, you'll know we usually only have one speaker, but as a special offer today, we've got three, which is rather exciting. I'll tell you a little bit about them. So Larissa Lockwood, who many of you will know, is Global Action Plan's Director of Clean Air. Building on 20 years experience in the sustainability sector, she oversees the Clean Air portfolio, which includes Clean Air Day, the Clean Air Hospital Framework Programme, Clean Air Public Insights Tracker, and the Clean Air for Schools Programme, which is what you're going to hear more about today. We've also got Tom Bannan. Welcome, Tom, who's an atmospheric scientist working at the University of Manchester. Works mostly on intensive observation periods on the FAAM research aircraft and on ground-based campaigns, particular interests in halogen and biomass burning chemistry using mass spectrometry instrumentation. Now works on the Manchester Urban Observatory project with a particular interest on monitoring of interventions that impact on air quality, which explains why he's here. And finally, we've got Martie van Tongeren, Professor of Occupational and Environmental Health at the University of Manchester, and leads the health theme within the Manchester Environmental Research Institute. His main interests are on occupational and environmental determinants of disease, and he's currently involved in a large national study on COVID-19, investigating risk of transmission in workplaces, on public transport, and in other environments too. So I think the way that we're going to run this is that in a few moments I'll be quiet, and Larissa's going to kick us off, and then Tom's going to follow, and then Martie's going to follow on from there. If each of you hand on to each other rather than handing back to me to hand on to you, that seems to make good sense, frankly. Just so that the audience knows, the presentations are going to cover, for Larissa, she's going to talk about the Clean Air Schools Framework. Thomas is going to talk about the impact of air purifiers on air quality in schools, and Martie is going to talk about the impact of air quality on cognitive function in primary school children. I think that's probably it for me. So I'm going to hand on to Larissa, who is my co-lead of Focus Area 4, so it's a pleasure to hand on to her, and I shall appear to disappear from the world. And don't forget to put your questions in the chat, and I'll see you at the end of all the presentations to post those to the speakers. Great, Larissa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Let's see if my sharing has worked and you get the full screen this time. I'm going to assume that's a yes. Great, so thank you. I'm the Director of Clean Air at Global Action Plan, and I'm going to be talking about how we came together with Tom and Martie at the University of Manchester to run the Clean Air for Schools programme before they talk in more detail on the sort of academic elements of the programme. But just to give a bit of context as to why we did it, and of course now the slides aren't even going to move. Are they moving for anyone else? No. Head shaking. I'm going to stop sharing that one and try again, because it's a bit annoying if you can't see them. Okay, is that moving? Nods, excellent. As we well know, children are particularly vulnerable to air pollution, and we're interested to find out not only about how air pollution sort of damages children's physical health, because we know it affects lung function development, can cause and worsen asthma in children, but also keen to explore, because in our sort of evidence base, we have this sort of mysterious statement that research is beginning to point towards the effects of air pollution on the developing brain. So we're like, how does air pollution sort of impact children's ability to learn, and what could we do about it? So we got together with the Phillips Foundation and the University of Manchester to answer these questions. So we're very grateful to the Phillips Foundation for funding the programme. And it very much was a partnership approach between the three organisations, with the aims to explore in a school setting what can be done to tackle air pollution. How can we help schools? In Manchester, we were doing this work, so with 20 schools in Manchester, but how can we then scale up the learnings by developing a tool that is useful to all schools to help them tackle air pollution? Let's find out the impact of different interventions, and along the way also research what impact reducing air pollution is going to have on children's health and their ability to learn. So Global Action Plan, we were leading on the sort of framework development, working with the schools and working with Tom on the measurement side of things, because we wanted to measure the impact of different interventions, whether that be a school street or a purifier, or a walk to school week, or different ventilation systems. So we had everything teed up and ready to go, and then COVID hit and all the schools shut. So we didn't actually get to measure any of the interventions bar the air purifiers, which Tom will talk about shortly. But what we did get from the programme was the insights from the schools that we are working with as to what would make a reasonable clean air action plan. So what sort of actions could a school do, how easy would it be for them to do it, and then how much impact did we think that it would have. And together with the schools, we then developed a Clean Air for Schools framework, which now is a freely available tool for any school to develop their own bespoke action plan. It's very easy to use, very quick to use. It's sort of been designed with and for teachers. And so you sort of do it in 15 minutes. And it looks at different areas to enable a school to reduce air pollution through their own operations at the school gate, but also looking at the role of schools in educating the next generation about air pollution, so that they and their families can help make cleaner air choices, and also the role of schools and the voice of children as being a local leader on air pollution, utilising that voice to sort of campaign for wider change. So the link to the framework is there. I won't talk about that one. This is how it looks. You answer a few bespoke questions about your school, what you've done before. You then get a list presented with a list of actions which have all been ranked in terms of their level of impact, how easy they would be to do, how much they might cost, and it then pops out a nice clean air action plan that looks like something like that. So please do get all schools that you know to use it. It's a great tool that we've developed with the academic insight of University of Manchester and with the input from the 20 schools. Not only tells you the kinds of things you can do, but also links through to all the resources that we could possibly find that would help a school to actually implement the measures. So you can see here where it says looking for inspiration, there's like the low emission bus guide. It mentions the Mayor of London's toolkit, speed limit reduction guidance there, and so on. So easy as possible. As I say, we didn't get all the research that we wanted from the project, but we did quite a bit on purifiers. So Tom's going to talk about that shortly. And we also got some really good insights into children's ability to learn, which we then communicated and put out there through the Clean Air Day story last year. Just a shameless plug, it is Clean Air Day on the 17th of June. If you're not planning to do anything at the moment, then you've still got time. There's the link. There's loads of resources to make it really easy. Right, Tom, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, guys, so good morning, everyone. I'll try and share my screen. Hopefully you guys can see that. Larissa, can you see that? Thumbs up, excellent. Okay, so yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Bannan. I'm a research fellow in the Centre for Atmospheric Science at the University of Manchester, sort of with a background in atmospheric composition and measurements of composition. I thought I'd take a little step back and sort of tell you a little bit about the project I'm working on and how that sort of led to the collaboration with Larissa and Martie, to give you some insight into the work that we're doing and then how that sort of led on into this really interesting gap work and the work we're doing with air purification systems. So I'm working for James Evans and David Topping, both who lead the Manchester Urban Observatory. And it's a really highly diverse team. So we've got expertise in health, in well-being, urban regeneration, atmospheric modelling. So all of the team come together to give quite a diverse understanding of the urban environment that we're living in. Next slides. Okay, so really the vision of this whole project is to work with stakeholders and researchers both nationally and internationally to try and understand and improve both outdoor and indoor environments in which we're living and working. And primarily we're trying to do this with underpinning this with sort of highly accurate baselines using all the available data, both existing data platforms and data platforms that we're adding to try and understand these urban environments. So this is really adding top of the line technology to existing infrastructure to try and understand what we're calling these living laboratories. So living and working in these cities, we're trying to understand these on a citywide level, but also on a classroom by classroom basis. So really depending on the type of question we're trying to answer, we deploy various sensor technologies, various analytical techniques to try and understand that question. The figure on the right here is a figure pulled from the original proposal, which really is showing the feedback loop of what we're trying to achieve here. We want to work with city leaders, we want to work with industries who are putting in interventions that could be of benefit to people's health and well-being, whether that be citywide changes implemented by Manchester City Council Transport for Greater Manchester, or whether that be things like this project where we are looking for a cost-effective mitigation strategy to perhaps improve the environment of the school children in their classroom. And what we're trying to do is use best available technology, best available analytical techniques to try and understand the effect they're having, both negative and perhaps and hopefully positive as well. And from an air quality background, this is really what I've been doing for the last 10 years, and what the atmospheric science community in research has been really driven around is these intensive observation periods, both on the FAM, Faculty for Atmospheric Measurement Techniques, or on the aircraft, where we do all sorts of funny flight plans like the one shown in the right here, where we're trying to track emissions of wetlands, for example, over Lake Victoria in Uganda, or the yellow flight track here, where we've got to find fires, natural fires, try to understand the emission of those and what effect they're having, or through these intensive observation periods on the ground, where we bring all the best available research grade technology together to try and get a complete picture of what is happening in the atmosphere in those at those spatial times. This is obviously limited heavily by resource, financially, and time-wise. But what you get from these is a really deep understanding of what that location is like and in that time. Obviously, you have like the AURN network sites, which also supplement UK air quality data and continuous monitoring sites. This is the sort of work that I was involved in. But interestingly, and I found it very interesting, over the last, 5, 6, 7 years, there's been this really upsurgence in what we're calling low-cost sensor technology to measure air quality. So it's a real divergence of what I've been involved with before. But nevertheless opens up some really interesting avenues and opens up some questions that you could answer with these sorts of techniques. So these techniques range from, a couple of £100 up to £15,000-20,000 but even at that price point, you can really start to think about buying a lot of them and answering some really interesting questions, such as going into schools and understanding air quality within each classroom versus outside, or monitoring interventions around cities. So potentially these open up some really interesting opportunities, these sorts of sensors. And I won't go into any detail about how they work, but very often they work on electrochemical sensors and optical particle counters, and generally, very much depending on which one you buy, of course, you generally get a measure of NOx, ozone, CO2, some PM data, some particle matter data of various sizes, and hopefully you'll get some meteorological data with that as well to help you try and understand that. But as I say, the cost-effective solution of these enable not just researchers to partake in this sort of research, but also potentially local authorities and individuals as well, which is really exciting. One caveat to that is perhaps the data quality of these is not always clear. So this is a correlation coefficient plot for various, I don't know if I can get my laser pointer up, but these are various, 3 or 4 years ago, some various leading sensor technologies against some reference grades in implementation. So the correlation coefficient of that is 1, of course. And what you see is, for a range of sensor technology, some perform really very well, some perform less well. So that opens up some questions about what sort of sensor technology should be used to answer a particular question. And that's where the work at the NERC Air Quality Super Site, and this is the roof that I've been on this morning, trying to deploy some sensors. And what we do here is we get together a whole range of sensor technology that we think could work very well, and deploy it over 18, 20 months, 2 years, to try and understand their performance under various conditions, under various seasons, so that we can make informed decisions about what sensors to use to answer particular questions. And this has been a really big step forward for us, and this is work we're collaborating on with various people at York, including Pete Edwards, to try and understand, against all of these highly detailed composition measurements of aerosol and gases, how do these sensors perform, which ones should we use under various conditions, and so on and so forth. And this provides an ideal test case to enable me to make informed decisions about what sensors we should use, and how they should be used, how they should be calibrated, and so on. Sorry, I can't. Next slide. And without doing that, sensor technologies and the application of these technologies has improved significantly over the last few years, and a lot of companies are doing a lot of great things. But what we want to do is try and understand that independently, so that we can make informed decisions, as I say. And that's really how we're building up our measurement strategy, is to understand which sensors should be used. How does that relate to existing infrastructure? For example, in the UK here, there's 250 AURN sites. Can that data be used to either supplement or answer the question you're trying to answer? Then combining that with artificial intelligence, traffic, understanding of traffic patterns through artificial intelligence, coding to try and say how many pedestrians are moving, how fast they're going, how many cyclists, and then you can build up a network of sensors, and this is University of Manchester campus, with 30 air quality sensors, and you can really dive into, right, Upper Brook Street is closed now to anything but buses. What impact has that had on Upper Brook Street, for example? So with these sorts of networks, with these sorts of sensors, you can get a really, really very detailed, very granular idea of what is happening at individual sites. And of course, in relation to this work, you can go into classrooms for short periods of time to try and answer the sort of questions that we're talking about today, and that is, of course, the efficiency of air purifiers in schools and what effect that they may have. And this is what it looks like in the end. These are all our sensors that we have, or some of them. It's an old plot now, but some of our sensors that we have across Greater Manchester. Traffic, obviously, in orange here, air quality in green, flood level, river levels in blue here. And really what we're trying to do is understand the effect of changes around the city, the effect of interventions And that's why we were really interested in this project, of course, because this application of air purifiers in childhood development, particularly when they're in school, of course, is really a potentially cost-effective mitigation strategy that Martie's going to talk about the effects of after me. And really coming back to this is where we got interested in this GAP project. Very interested is trying to understand the effect of this intervention. So obviously it's much smaller scale, but nevertheless, this could be really something that's actually quite powerful if done right. And I'm no expert in these high efficiency particulate air filters, but nevertheless, they have been tested in controlled environments and have been shown to be very effective at removing particulate matter from the air. But what is clear to me is that you have to test these sorts of things in the environment in which they're going to be used. Things like, thinking about classroom, for example, you've got kids going in and out all day, you've got windows open, you've got various activities that they're doing in the classroom. All of these things are going to influence how effective these air purifiers are at purifying the air in that classroom. So that's really why we got involved, is to analyse the effect that these have in the environment in which we hope they can be used effectively. And so we went in, Martie and I set up on the first day at Russell Scott Primary School with some representatives from GAP and Philips, and we installed a whole range of sensors and the purifier technology. For this project, we primarily used this portable optical particle spectrometer. The reason being, first one, it performed extremely well at the air quality super site, and it's backed by a whole load of research. But there's a whole body of research that understands the uncertainty, how they should be used, calibration techniques, and that's something that we could really work with. This is very much on the upper end of the low-cost sensor market, but it's certainly something that is worthwhile to ensure the accuracy and the confidence in the measurements that we're making. And interestingly, I always think this is interesting that they were actually developed by NOAA and NASA for airborne deployments. So they needed something that was extremely light, extremely robust, and of course they wanted the data to be good. So they independently developed these POPs instruments, and they identified a need for them. They identified the process in which they would make the measurements, and they deployed these very effectively. And that's why we got involved with them, because they really are a very cool bit of kit that can be used in a whole load of different ways with a very low power consumption as well. So they can be run from batteries, of course. So that's why we used that piece of kit. And we had a very simple experimental design. We had 3 POPs units, one of them outdoors, one of them in a classroom with a purifier, the other one in another classroom with a purifier. And essentially what we did was continuous measurements with the POPs of PM 2.5 with the POPs, and cycled classroom 1 and classroom 2, the purification being on or off at various defined intervals during the school working day, and basically compare and contrast the effectiveness of the purification units in that way. And this is the sort of data that we get out. So on the bottom here, I won't spend too much time on this, but this is PM 2.5 measurements, a consistent time series of PM for 2 weeks. On the top here in blue is the purifier in classroom 1. The orange here is purifier in classroom 2, and essentially 0.75 means both purifiers are on, goes to both off. And on the Tuesday, the purifier in classroom 2 was on, 1 off, and so on and so forth. This was, the data set is not as long as we would like, of course. We would like to understand this over a much longer time period. but it was important to us to get into as many schools as possible to try and test out the effectiveness of this in a range of environments. So despite the short time series, this is a sort of experimental design and the sort of data that we use to try and understand this question. And I think this is approaching my final slide. We measured, I think, in 6 or 7 schools, which was unfortunately stopped with the schools closing, of course. But what we saw in the first school was actually there were some really positive signs that these purifiers could be effective in the classroom setting. We saw a PM reduction of up to 37% in the school environment. I will caveat that by saying this was a very short data set and it could have been influenced by local effects and things like that, of course. But there were some positive signs that these purifiers could be effective at reducing PM in the classroom setting. That wasn't always the case, of course. In some schools, we saw very little effect of these purifiers, but that could be down, I'm almost sure that was either down to building design or behaviours within classrooms, for example. So I think there's some very positive signs within this data, but it's something that we certainly would like to look into more and make more measurements of. And of course, if they work to that sort of level, that can have a really nice knock-on effect to the stuff that Martie is going to talk about now, hopefully. So Martie, I think over to you now, if that's
okay.
okay.
Thank you, Tom. I'll
end the show. There you go. Thanks, Martie.
all right. First test. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Can you see that? Yeah, is that my, yeah, okay. So thanks, Tom, thanks, Larissa. I'll talk over in the next 10-15 minutes or so on some of the work that we've done, as part of this project, looking at a kind of air quality in and around schools and how that affects the kind of performance of primary school children. And I think GAP and Phillips Foundations were really kind of keen to kind of for us to kind of look at kind of educational attainment and how air quality really kind of affected the ability to learn. I think we kind of realized quite early that was quite difficult. So we kind of looked at some ways of trying to go and trying to answer that question to some extent. Because of the kind of like the limitations of the resources and timing, we weren't able to do our own kind of kind of intervention studies and exercise, because that would be quite a complicated, as you can imagine, kind of study. So what we did is basically looked at what evidence there is available from the literature and then see how we could make sense of that and make some predictions. So I'll now struggle with going forward. So I think it's I think that I don't have to tell anyone that air pollution is seriously impacting kind of people's health across the globe, both indoor and outdoor. The total impact on kind of health and number of deaths is quite astonishing in both the UK and elsewhere. But kind of in the past, we probably mainly focused on the impacts that air quality has and air pollution has on kind of like respiratory and cardiovascular kind of health outputs. And I think in the last 5 to 10 years, more and more kind of evidence has appeared that it's also kind of impacting what I think we collectively call our brain health, and that's both at the younger age and at the older age. So there's regular papers now appearing that demonstrate the impact of air pollution on things like dementia and Alzheimer's in older age. But it's also at the younger age that we are keen and interested to see what impact that the air quality has. So GAP and Phillips Foundation approached us to help them with that project, and really kind of look at how kind of interventions such as air purifiers can help, and how they can kind of improve kind of brain health or learning in schools, in primary schools and settings. So as I said, what we did, we would have really liked to kind of do a kind of study, an observational or intervention study, and I'm still really keen to kind of explore that, because one of the things that we found from the literature review is that actually there's not a huge amount of evidence there, but we kind of really started by looking at the literature and investigating the links between air pollution and executive functioning in primary school age children. And we focused on the impact of the air quality in and around schools, because we really wanted to kind of see, well, what can schools do about this issue. We kind of chose executive function because it is kind of linked to a kind of educational attainment. But it's quite difficult to quantify the effect on the attainment as such. So what do we mean with executive functioning? Is really kind of things like working memory, impulse inhibition, cognitive flexibility and planning. And any kind of psychologist amongst you will understand this much better than I do. But it's a collective term for kind of a range of cognitive processes that manage and controls our thoughts, emotions, and actions. So really kind of like the better obviously your working memory and your kind of cognitive flexibility, the better you're able to learn. And these kind of things kind of grow when you're young. So these are not static kind of abilities. So especially when you're younger, the working memory grows over time, and I'll show you that in a little bit as well. And then I think they plateau at teenage years, and then unfortunately for most of us, they will decline over our lifetime. First slowly, and then unfortunately rather rapidly at some. We kind of did the literature search. We looked for studies that included kind of either continuous or and quantitative measures of cognitive or academic achievement, and also cognitive or academic. That seems to be double there, and then also kind of looked at air pollution measures. And they were excluded if they only reported pollution exposures outside of school settings, because we, as I said before, we really wanted to kind of see what the levels of pollution in and around school had as an impact. And we also excluded if they were purely non-traffic related. So as I said, there wasn't really a huge amount of studies there. This is, and we are kind of in the process of publishing this kind of work. So we found kind of 9 studies across Europe, North America, and South America. But of those 9 studies, the 9 studies, there's only there was Spain. There's one in the UK. And then one in Austria, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And then especially the Spanish study was quite substantial, because it actually resulted in a number of publications. So these kind of studies, they investigated different traffic-related air pollutants, such as the things that Tom kind of earlier kind of mentions: PM2.5, PM10, NO2 were the main ones that were most common in the studies. But other things like elemental carbon, black carbon, ozone, carbon monoxide, and others were also included in some of the studies. And these were either kind of directly measured by the kind of techniques that, again, Tom explained, although some studies also kind of included kind of modeling approaches based upon kind of stationary samples throughout the city. So like I said, 9 studies, they measured things in different ways. So school attainment, some studies looked at, and these are often kind of ecological studies, so they looked at grouped kind of responses across groups. So they looked at whether some either interventions or increased or higher pollution levels affected kind of test scores or grade point averages, and then other studies looked more on individual kind of impacts, looking at, like I said, working memory and attention. And I kind of mentioned the study in Barcelona, and this was really kind of the main and strongest piece of evidence that we could find. And that was done already about 6 or 7 years ago by the group that is now called IS Global, and I'm sure that some of you will be aware of this this institute, which is I think probably one of the handful of big hitters in terms of environmental epidemiology in Europe. And what they've done is they studied kids in 39 schools across Barcelona, and they were kind of selected schools with high and low kind of pollution levels. So in the graph here, you see the kind of points. This is Barcelona. It looks a little bit weird in this plot because of the way that it's expressed in terms of pollution. But the kind of white dots are the schools that are low kind of background level of exposures, and the black dots have the schools with a higher kind of pollution levels. And interestingly, you might kind of like kind of already kind of say, well, isn't there a potential for some bias because the high pollution schools were kind of looked more like inner city schools. They still, and that may have impacted on socioeconomic status and deprivation levels, etc. But they were quite able to kind of pair the schools on socioeconomic index. So apparently Barcelona is not arranged in such a way that all the kind of poorer areas are in the city center. So they were able to kind of match that quite carefully, and therefore take out the impact of deprivation and socioeconomic status. They've kind of done kind of pollution measurements in the schools at over 1 week periods, twice in a year, both indoor and outdoor in the courtyard. And they kind of like then use that to kind of determine kind of longer term average exposures. And they mainly focused on elemental carbon, ultrafine particles, and NO2. And they kind of then measured repeatedly over a year kind of these cognitive functions. So inattentiveness, so the opposite of attentiveness, the kind of working memories, and these are certain kind of like tasks that some of you may also kind of try to do on your iPhone in terms of kind of these brain kind of training things that you can do. So they kind of done them really kind of carefully in controlled settings within all the pupils in that in certain years, and they done that 4 times in the year, and then they looked at the changes over time and compared that and linked that with the air pollution levels. And what they found here is that that's children attending schools with higher levels, both indoor and outdoors, experience a kind of smaller growth function of these brain functions. So as I said before, your over time, your working memory will increase. So that will increase as well over that year. And this graph here, I don't know whether you can see that with my cursor, but this graph here shows the trajectory of the average trajectory of children in low pollution schools and the average trajectory of children in high pollution schools. And you can see that there's a substantial difference in those trajectories. And then follow-up studies showed that also was kind of continued over a longer period of time. So even after 3.5, 4 years, these kind of different trajectories kind of continued. So that really kind of like was the strongest kind of available evidence. I think that that shows that increased pollution is associated with a decreased executive functioning, a negative impact on working memory due to PM, and a negative impact of working memory and by NO2, and I think PM was also associated with some other kind of cognitive outcomes. So what are the implications of this? So, really kind of shows that that traffic-related air pollution appears to hamper developmental trajectory of working memory, and as I mentioned before, levels of working memory are kind of associated with achievement at schools. And then predictive relationship between executive functioning and working memory, in particular early childhood and performance to the rest of the educational system. So this is really kind of looking at some other kind of evidence that shows, well, if your kind of working memory is affected, this is a very good chance that will then also affect the ability to do well within the schooling system. So then we kind of like done some fairly simple kind of modeling in terms of what that kind of means in terms of interventions and we kind of looked at 2 pollutants, and these are kind of like looked at what can be achieved by kind of reduction in air pollution. And this is a kind of a relative measure that if you do nothing, you kind of like and stay at the current levels of pollution, then this kind of level of working memory at 48, which is a kind of measure at one of the kind of like tests that you can do. But then you can see that if you're kind of reducing pollutions, you kind of you're predicted to do much better on these tests. So reduction by 50% will lead to a 15% increase in that particular scale. And what that means in terms of over time, and this is a kind of hypothetical kind of example, that if you start at the same point, what would happen if you're in case of a current do nothing scenario and your growth is predicted to be at a certain level, and then we at that score of a working memory, and then we kind of like said, well, what would we expect to happen if you have a 20 to 50% reduction in pollution? And really what you can then kind of show is that you achieve theoretically at least achieve the same kind of working memory at an earlier stage in the child's development, and that could be several weeks of that effect. So decreases in air pollution could lead to considerable increases in that growth and working memory, and we kind of we made based upon some assumptions, we kind of then estimated that a 12% reduction in outdoor NO2 would lead to a kind of an improvement of around 3 weeks in terms of achieving the same amount, and a 50% reduction would lead to about 7 to 9 weeks kind of improvement, i.e. that you get to that same level at an earlier stage. And similar kind of effects were observed when we looked at PM 2.5 in an indoor environment. So these are fairly theoretical kind of calculations, and it would be really kind of interesting to be able to design and develop kind of proper intervention studies that test that, but these are clearly quite complicated. But even without those kind of intervention studies, I think it is quite clear for this and other reasons that it's important to address pollution in and around schools, both for kind of general health, but also in terms of ability to learn, and it's not only kind of like a good way to get the pupils to improve their learning overall, but I think if you go into schools, and that's the example I think that GAP will know better than probably anyone else, is that if you're kind of engaged with kids, they get really quite excited about this, and actually the added benefit is that they might become really kind of interested in sciences too, and that is only good for all our futures. So I think that's where I'm ending. I'm so happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you, Martie, and thank you, Tom, and thank you, Larissa, as well. What I'll do is fire questions at you, actually, which have been ramping up in the chat. So maybe I'll come back to the start. I've tried to collate together questions that are asking about the similar things. So the first one's for Tom. Could you say a little bit more about the types of behavioural changes or building conditions that may have meant the purifiers worked less or more well, or sort of affected their efficacy?
I guess the biggest one that springs to mind is the rate of indoor-outdoor exchange, or exchange with other classrooms which don't have purification or have other activities in them. That would be the big ones to me. So simple things like, are the windows open? Are kids going in and out of the classroom constantly? Is it a closed classroom? Very often the classrooms we were in were not completely closed, therefore. So it's really about the rate of the volume of air you're trying to purify versus the rate of purification and the effectiveness of that purification, particularly for PM, of course. If you were talking about gases, I guess the answer would be slightly different. But really the one that springs to mind, and I'm no expert in this, but it's the exchange rate would be the big one for me.
Great, thanks, Tom. One from Peter Carey, one from Forrest, and I think I'll have to paraphrase it because I think the word was auto spelt wrongly. Have you identified levels of pollution in classrooms which would be justified or recommended? And do you think parents would be concerned about air pollution levels if HEPA filters were installed?
That's not something I've really, to be honest, thought about. What we were looking for in these experiments was relative change between the classrooms. I think it was fair to say the levels of PM were lower indoors than outdoors in the schools that we visited. But yeah, we were really looking at relative change rather than absolute quantification. And then I guess that will have a knock-on effect to what Martie presented is actual levels. So I think, yeah, it's generally lower than outdoors from the measurements we made. Whether, yeah, I think that I would leave the health implications to Martie.
Sure. And Martie, we'll come back to you in a bit. Another one for Tom. As researchers, how can we select the air quality sensors and measuring equipment that we want to use, and what criteria should we use when selecting them?
That's also a very good question. It's extremely difficult to do that if you don't have a super site in your back garden. So it's very difficult to do that independently. There are some very good companies doing some very good work, and they have very detailed calibration procedures that enable good data. The thing that's really jumped out at me when doing this is companies which apply laboratory calibrations to their sensors, i.e. don't go out into the field and measure an ambient environment and then try and apply that to an ambient environment. I think that makes, hopefully that makes sense. They work significantly less well in comparison to sensors that have been calibrated in the environment in which they are going to be used. So there's, for example, it's no good, or you would struggle more if you calibrated your sensor in California versus Manchester. Temperature and relative humidity have a big effect on the output of these. So I would try and understand their calibration and ensure that that's representative of what you want to measure. Whether that be indoor or outdoor, that also has a big effect. It's a difficult question to answer because there's a lot in the market, and very many of them are doing very good work. So it's difficult for me to say.
Super, and I think you've put your email in the chat in case anybody wants to follow up. There's one final one for you. Could you say a bit more about your network of traffic and air quality sensors? What do your traffic sensors measure? And will this network allow you to evaluate the effectiveness of traffic interventions too?
Yeah, well, that's exactly, we are trying to actively understand the effect of traffic mitigation on air quality. We're doing that actively with Transport for Greater Manchester and Manchester City Council. They're driving the change, and what we're trying to do is understand the effect that has on traffic levels, importantly, both at the site where the intervention is happening, but also the knock-on effect areas. So it's not just trying to understand, you close, in the example I gave, you close Oxford Road to vehicles, but what effect does that have on the parallel street to that? But that's what these sensors allow you to answer, is really the effect of that. And in relation to the question about the traffic sensors, some traffic sensors are really extremely clever now. They use artificial intelligence to interpret video images, and that can give you information on pedestrian counts, pedestrian speed, which way these people are walking, what path they're taking, cyclists, are they using cycle lanes, are they using the pavement? So there's a really great level of detail that you can get from these cameras on top of what you'd expect now, which is really exciting from our point of view, thinking about well-being and behavioural change as well as environmental change as well. The last thing, all of that data is going into a website called manchestereye.com. So if anyone's interested in that, you can either pop me an email or go to the site directly. You can click on any sensor and it will give you a level, either of traffic or river height or air pollution, whatever interests you. So yeah, be very happy to share that, and it's great if it gets some use.
Lovely. Thank you, Tom. Martie, there's a few for you as well, unsurprisingly. A number of questions focusing around correlation and causation. So whether or not the pollutants that were measured, was any evidence that they could actually be causative in terms of their impact on executive function. And I know there's some evidence that, for example, carbon dioxide can increase anxiety, and that can impact on executive function. So could some of these pollutants be acting as a proxy for something else that actually has a causative impact?
Yeah, I think that's clearly a very good and important question. This is based upon observational studies, and clearly observational studies will always struggle to kind of prove causality, and clearly there are limited studies available. Not all the studies that were available in the literature were of particularly high quality. So there is clearly a kind of a question mark around the causality. I mean, the study I think was particularly good, and I mentioned that they were able to kind of account and address kind of potential confounding by socioeconomic status. But clearly there may be other kind of like factors that they not have been able to take into account. And one of the things actually that I'm not entirely sure about is whether they've been able to look at a kind of things like ventilation in the schools themselves, because I think we're all aware that if the level of stuffiness in a room will affect these kind of things as well, at least at the short term. In terms of whether whether these specific markers of PM 2.5 or NO2 or some of the others are causative agents, again, I think whether these are causative agents or whether these are kind of markers for something that's a wider kind of like issue. Again, there's question marks. I mean, there are some biological kind of plausible kind of type mechanisms that we can look at. So we know that these particulates, fine particulates, can either kind of transfer from the nose up to the brain via olfactive nerve. We know that they can be cause kind of inflammatory kind of responses, kind of locally, but also systemically. So there are some biological kind of like plausibilities in this, and I think, you know, the totality of the you know, of the evidence in terms of you know, impact of air pollution on brain health is growing. So I think there is definitely something there, and you know, but there's still quite a lot more to do in terms of the exact kind of like causative agent. If it is one causative agent, it could be a multiple of different kind of markers, and what the actual mechanisms is. I think there's still quite a lot of work to be done there.
Lovely, thank you very much. There's a couple of comments in the chat which maybe just worth passing on to you. One which asked whether or not you were working with educational psychologists or cognitive psychologists who deal with working memory. The other from Mike Holland, who's asking if you're aware of literature on air pollution and chest performance as well, which sounds like it could be quite interesting.
Yeah, I kind of actually, sorry, I've responded to Mike privately, but yeah, no, I wasn't actually aware of the chess, and that sounds really quite interesting, and could be an interesting kind of like topic for an intervention kind of a project, I guess. In terms of the educational psychologists, we did work together with educational and other psychologists. The person who did the review was a health psychologist by background. It's not my background, and and it's clearly, you know, clearly kind of like it's not simple, and you know, many other factors play a role in the development of working memory and cognitive function and educational attainment. So it's not, you know, I'm sorry if it kind of looked like a very linear kind of line, and it was very kind of like simple. That's clearly not the case, and you know, kind of air quality is one of many factors that will kind of and perhaps, you know, on an individual level not the main factor, but I think on a population level it might become important.
Thank you, Martie, and I've noticed the time's 2:01, so we should try to wrap up. The first thing I'd like to do is thank Larissa, Tom, and Martie for what's been a really interesting lunchtime seminar, actually, and definitely part of the reason why I'm in Tapas, listening to ideas about the impact on children's performance in schools. Next week, Sophie's just popped in the chat. It will be Mike Biffle from University of Cambridge, who's talking about agent-based modelling and its applications in relation to improving air quality at school. There's more info on a link in the chat, and also she's reminding you that our lunchtime seminars are all recorded and are available on the link which is there. So thank you very much, all three of you, and thank you everybody for coming, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.